that there is a dramatic level of hypocrisy when the right focuses on one particular piece of the Constitution versus another.
Wait, are you willing to let us give up our guns if you give up your illegals? Is that what I'm hearing? I got to run that back. I got to run that back. I got to run it up the food chain and see if we're willing to make that deal. Well, it is great to be back for episode 2 of United Debates of America. We are 1 week out from the start of I shouldn't say 1 week out. We're 1 week since the start of the Trump presidency. A lot has happened. Zach, we originally thought about doing this episode immediately after Trump's inaugural speech, but for a whole host of reasons that got pushed back. And I'm actually glad that it did, because we get to talk about the empirical as opposed to the abstract, right? He said a lot of things in that inaugural speech. He's also done a lot of things. There's no question about that. We will certainly disagree on whether he should have done those things.
Sure.
But that's where we are. And so 8 days in, it's January 28th as we film this.
Yep.
8 days in, Zach Kimball, how are you feeling? Be honest. The good, you have no problem with the bad and the ugly, Zach.
Yeah.
But can I ask you first?
Sure.
We start with the good. Can you see any good? I know I can. A lot
Sure,
of folks can on my side. Can you see any good from President Trump's first 8 days back in office?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's in the spirit of what we're trying to do here, so I'll gladly start there. I can find a few things that I feel okay about. I think if we want to start with immigration, the one thing that I feel most people on both sides of the aisle can agree with is that we should be deporting criminal illegal immigrants. I think that's totally fine. And I think that the Trump administration has definitely seen an uptick, especially in the past few days, in trying to do that. So I can give them credit there. I think that's a good thing to do. I think they've already made a number of mistakes, which I'll get into later in this debate within that. And the threshold for being a criminal is definitely something to debate. But in terms of getting certain violent criminals out, I think that's good. Something the Biden administration probably should have done and didn't do. I'm definitely struggling to find anything else where it really jumps out. Most other things I'm either indifferent to or kind of appalled by. So, I'll kind of start there. That I do feel like that's a thing that everybody can, not everybody, but most people can probably get on board with.
That includes the deportation flights?
Of lights?
The deportation flights.
Oh, flights. I thought you said lights like that. I think, you're talking about specifically the Colombia situation, or are you talking about just
there's been others, Mexico as well, the Colombia situation, which really interestingly ties into our last discussion about tariffs, right? But do you support the forced removal of criminal illegal aliens in this country?
I think it depends on the circumstances. So, if you're going to go down the road that I know the right goes down, which is to determine that everybody who's here illegally is by extension a criminal, then no, I don't agree with that. Well, right, that's where the difference will come. Where we can agree, I think, is on people who are convicted criminals here who have a criminal record that isn't beyond, very traffic tickets and trespassing and things like that. That's a different story. But I'm on board with the deportation of folks who pose a threat to society. Unquestionably, I think you'd have to be, I don't really know what you'd have to be to believe that that's wrong, but I think that that's okay. But I do not support the broad spectrum removal of people who are illegally. No, I think that there are smarter ways to do it. And I think it would be a major disruption to the economy as well as just society in general. And I expect this to be a rough road for the Trump administration ahead. I don't think this is going to be an easy thing for them to execute. I think it's going to be a very bad PR problem for them. They're going to make a lot of mistakes. They've already made a lot of mistakes. It's like 3 days since they started the Operation Upticks. I think it's going to get really messy if they go down the road of true full-scale what Trump promised mass deportations. I think you're going to run into some massive trouble there. So far, that's not what they're aiming at, and I think their aim for the beginning is correct, focusing on criminals. But the question becomes, how do you define a criminal? I mean, there was this guy, I forget his last, Fidel Ambrosio, I think his name was, that was profiled where he was here for 19 years, here illegally. He has a wife and 2 children who are here legally, and he's being separated from them because he has a criminal trespassing conviction from, I think 15 years ago. So he's going back to a country he hasn't been to in 2 decades, leaving a 4-year-old and a 4-month-old behind. That's the kind of situation where I go, no, that person should not be deported, just taken out of their house and thrown out of the country right away. Absolutely not. I think, circumstantially, if you were convicted of a heinous crime, get out of here. I think that that's a place where we can have a different debate, but I think they're wildly different to me personally.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I mean, just to be fair, that is a criminal conviction, right? The criminal
Sure,
trespassing, right?
sure.
And so I think we both agree that the lowest hanging fruit, and it seems that look, there's when you're rounding up 1,000 people a day
Hmm.
and sending them back.
Yep.
There's always going to be some that you're going to find questionable, but for the
Sure.
most part, these are criminals, not in the sense of just violating USC 1325A, which of course is illegal entry into the United States, not just
Hmm.
criminals in that sense, but actual hardened criminals. I think we both agree you want to go for that low hanging fruit, right, Zach?
I think it depends on how you define hardened, right? I don't think a hardened criminal is somebody who's been charged with trespassing. I think if you're talking about a hardened criminal, I want to see something that has violence involved or the threat of violence,
Yeah.
something that is more menacing to society. There, I could absolutely see that as low hanging fruit. But when it comes
Right.
to rounding up anybody who has even a minor infraction just to justify them to being defined as a criminal,
Sure.
absolutely not. And that's unquestioned. I think you could probably agree that is the approach the Trump administration is taking at this point.
No, well, what I would say is that if you are currently if you are currently fleeing justice,
Mhm.
right? There's currently a warrant out for your arrest. You would agree. You got to go home. You got to get out, right?
Depends on what the warrant is for,
Right.
at least for me personally.
Well, I think that's fine. And I think we can disagree on that. Look, I view if you're shoplifting a business and you're using force against a small business in the Bronx, no one should do that. Citizen, non-citizen, illegal doesn't matter.
Agreed.
But in any event, I think it's important for us to discuss the wider effects here. And we can talk
Mhm.
about what happened with Colombia. My mother's Colombian. I
Mhm.
spent every summer of my life, including this past one, visiting.
Nice.
But I think it's interesting to also note that whether it was the canceling of the CBP One app, which over 1 million people had used to get appointments, try to claim asylum in the US,
Mhm.
whether it's the number of border crossings having essentially collapsed down to just several hundred as of yesterday, there's a real shift happening, Zach. So we can talk about mass deportation. I think there's going to be mass deportations.
I
I
agree.
think they're going to be largely self deportation. I think a lot of people are going to look around and say, you know what? The free benefits that New York and Chicago once offered as sanctuary cities, those will be gone in a couple of months. The businesses that were employing a lot of this, and I shouldn't say employing, Zach. I should say exploiting a lot of this cheap migrant labor. They're going to see crackdowns as well. So I think a lot of people are going to look around 6 months from now and say, no more handouts, no more being used as free labor. The situation back home wasn't perfect, but it makes sense for me to leave of my own volition and not to become an enemy of the US that would preclude me, as Trump has said, would preclude me from re-entering on a legal basis in the future. And
Mhm.
look, you saw it with what's happening with the border crossings, right? The people got the message. Like there were people who were halfway here who got on the plane, turned around and said, there's no point. And I mean, it was sad, I think, to see some of these images of people who had traversed this long distance. And I can admit that it was sad to see people breaking down. But they should not have made this journey in the first place. They were to come here. They were promised the world by big Democrat blue cities. They were promised the world with entitlement benefits. They were going to be exploited by big businesses. And it's just sad to see. But, I think at the end of the day, on the immigration point, and we saw this with the Colombia point, is that look, if you don't want to accept your people back, and by the way, Zach, let's just put politics aside here.
Mhm.
Under President Biden, we accepted the Colombians. Truth, we did. Whether you agree with it or disagree with it, I disagree with it, but we accepted them.
Sure.
Now we were going to send them back
Mhm.
on a plane, not by the way, not sending them through the perilous journey that they subjected themselves to. The statistics, by the way, are incredible. 1 out of 3 women, Zach, 1 out of 3 women will tragically be sexually assaulted on
Mhm.
their way to the southern border. So we put them on a plane that we paid for and we flew them back down home so they could get resettled. And what does the Colombian president do? He refuses to take them back. And so, just to pick up on our last discussion, rather fittingly about tariffs, if you and I had a debate and said, well, Trump threatened 25% tariffs, what's that going to do to coffee prices from Colombia? What's that going to do to flowers in the lead up to Valentine's Day? It wasn't 8 minutes, literally, it wasn't 8 minutes until the Colombian president relented and said, you know what? We'll take them. In fact, we'll send the presidential plane to get them and to help you transport our people to come back home. And what I think that tells you, Zach, just to wrap it up, because I know you have a lot to respond to there. What that tells you is that when you are the greatest economy in the world, you get to act like it. When you have issues, you can just do things. If Colombia did not want to accept its own people, we weren't sending a bunch of Haitians back there. We were sending back their own people in an airplane safely and securely back to their home country, and the president refused them. If you are going to disrespect this country, disrespect our president, disrespect taxpayers, disrespect our rule of law, you deserve tariffs. It just so happens that the Colombian president, after making a string of bad decisions, made the right decision in the moment, relented, agreed with Trump, didn't get the tariffs, and guess what? Everything is copacetic now. And so I think that's where we leave off on that particular point. We have to use economic leverage when and where necessary. Look, if you kidnap an American in Turkey, we're going to threaten tariffs, as we did under President Trump's first term with the pastor Andrew Brunson. If you're going to play games in the Middle East, we're going to use tariffs. Donald Trump, by the way, for all this Russia collusion hoax nonsense, he has said that he is looking at economic leverage against Russia to bring an end to the war. And so President Trump recognizes that when you have economic leverage, be it tariffs or sanctions, and you can advance American interests in the process, you do it and you don't apologize. Zach, thoughts?
There's a lot to unpack in that one. So I'll start where you ended with the Russia situation. Right. So Trump already did that. He threatened sanctions on Russia, and Russia pretty much responded by going, we don't care, which is exactly what is the situation. I mean, this is a perfect example of how Trump oversimplifies his ability to negotiate and say, I'm a great negotiator. But in the end, he promised that he would end the war in Ukraine before the term started. That didn't work. And now
he did get a ceasefire, and he did get a ceasefire though, and get the hostages out.
No, he also did that in concert with Joe Biden. So that's
well,
not exactly.
But to be fair, and by the way, I don't necessarily disagree that President Biden's that there was some role there. But remember, this was going on for 15 months, Zach.
No, I understand.
15 months,
Look, I'm not
Biden
going to take credit away there. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about.
No, I know. But to be fair, it probably did have something to do with Donald Trump threatening that all hell would break loose.
Of course, there's no question about that. But that's not the point. It's also a far less complex situation than the Russia-Ukraine situation, because you have a very different set of circumstances there. So Trump has threatened tariffs and sanctions on Russia. Russia has responded with a big shrug, and I don't care. Because Trump's problem, and I've said this recently on some of my channels, is that when you're beating up on a country like Colombia that is not anywhere near the standing economically or in the world in general,
right,
like Colombia is, and you're trying to beat up on them, it's much easier to bully them with the threat of a major tariff, because that will cause major disruption in their country. But when you're threatening that to a heavy hitter in a complex situation with a lot of different variables, and you have a president like Putin who's not the kind to be pushed around and bullied, it's not going to work. So then you end up with a guy who has a bunch of different circumstances like, hey, I have a huge promise I made that I'm going to end the war. I have one willing participant in Ukraine and one unwilling participant in Russia. Guess what's going to happen? Nothing. Trump is not going to be able to exert his power there. But anyway, moving on from that point, then let's jump all the way back to the very beginning of your point. The concept that all of these different illegal immigrants are going to, on their own volition, leave at the same rate at which we're going to deport them. There is absolutely no way that's true. I would place a hefty wager on that being, if you fast forward 6 months, that the numbers will not bear that. Because in the end, even if the conditions change, even if they're not getting any kind of benefit like they would get from a sanctuary city, there are plenty of illegal immigrants in non-sanctuary cities, including my own. And there have been ICE raids in my own city. And those folks, the difference between working in a non-sanctuary city, getting a minimum wage or less job, is still dramatically better than the circumstances in many of these Central American, South American countries. And that's the reason they leave. And they're also not the best and brightest from these countries. And that's a Republican talking point all the time. We're not getting their best. We're getting their criminals and this and that. You're not really, that's largely not true. You do get some of them, but what you really get is the lower class of these countries. And when you consider what the lower class of these countries that are second and third world countries are, that is a not great life. And it's, the way you've defined it is like, it's not so bad. It's terrible. That's why they make the journey here. And it's a very dangerous journey. I agree. Going through things like the Darien Gap and risking your life. You're doing it because the circumstances you're coming from are terrible. So I would be extremely surprised if that happened. Then the fact that we fly them back this being presented as some sort of dignity saving event is ridiculous, because we have seen multiple complaints in the last week from other countries, especially Brazil, who noted that the conditions on these planes were subhuman conditions. We didn't put them on a cushy plane and fly them first class. We flew them on old military jets with no air conditioning, handcuffed to each other. They were in terrible conditions. So this idea that we put them in a position where they're being, valued, they're being just as devalued as they were when they're being thrown out the door of the country. So that is, something I definitely can't get behind. And so when we get back to the meat of this whole thing, what really concerns me the most about all this, well, it's two things. But first, I'll start here. My primary concern with mass deportations is the effect on the economy. The economy heavily relies on the labor of these folks in certain industries where it cannot be replaced quickly or easily. Certain places like agriculture, construction, there are a number of jobs that, yes, maybe over time they can be filled, but in the short term, by short term, I mean like a week, I mean potentially
Yeah.
years, is going to be extraordinarily disruptive to a lot of different industries, and it's going to unquestionably raise prices. And as much as Donald Trump wants to talk about having a mandate and winning in a landslide, he barely won this election. When you look at the numbers, it was not like he blew her away. He barely won with a set of circumstances where he should have absolutely decimated her, but he didn't, because he's Donald Trump and not a regular person. And in the end, he won because people want lower prices. And if he does not deliver on that single promise, he and the Republican Party are going to get shellacked in 26 and 28 if he does not prioritize that promise. Because right now, I think the biggest issue the Republicans have is they're misinterpreting this mandate and going, people don't want DEI, people are anti-woke. That is not the majority of the country. The majority of the country voted for this guy for prices, prices, prices. And this kind of stuff is going to do the opposite of what he was elected to do. So that very much concerns me. And the second thing that very much concerns me, where I think the meat of this issue is that as we continue down this road with mass deportations, we're going to see more and more critical errors being made, whether it's the violence in which it's used to deport people, who is chosen to be deported, what are the circumstances of the deportation, the stories behind it. Once one critical error is made, let's say like a George Floyd level error, then you have George Floyd level circumstances. And when you have that kind of unrest, Donald Trump is an unpredictable asset. There's no question about it. And I think when you get to the concept of civil unrest, we have a president who previously was accused by his own defense secretary of saying, hey, just shoot him in the legs. Why can't you just shoot the protesters in the legs? So we'll have, now that he has this administration and not a bunch of sane Republicans in the room with him, we will very likely see exactly that sort of stuff being carried out. Those are the primary pillars of this that actually concerns me. Everything else, it's concerning, but these are the two that I would focus in on as like my major concerns.
Yeah. It's one of those things that I think it's about trade-offs, right? Thomas Sowell, the economist, always said there are no solutions, Zach. There are just trade-offs. It's like the trade-off has to be on the immigration point versus the economy. Look, I'm not saying you believe this. I'm just saying it.
Mm.
Slavery, getting rid of slavery was bad for the Southern economy. Just a fact. Objectively, it doesn't change my view. Obviously, your view. Let's just be clear here.
Mm-hmm.
Getting rid of slavery was disastrous for the Southern economy. In fact, many people in the 1860s made this point that slavery, its abolition, would destroy the South, would destroy job opportunities, would increase costs, and it actually did. So just on that point alone, I'm not equating your position to the defense of slavery.
But it's not just my position, though. It's the whole position, right? I mean, like, are you equating the whole position to it?
Well, no. What I'm just saying is this idea that I consider a lot of them, and I'm actually in a unique position. So I don't. I think one thing that you do, and it's okay, but I'll push back on it, is the right and the left. And I think something for our viewers to do in this, just as a learning thing, and you can disagree. I think you will agree, though, is that when you're having these types of debates with friends and family and coworkers, don't assume what their position is on that particular issue. Because I think it's fair to say, Zach, that actually my positions are pretty nuanced from a typical Republican, right? That the Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney, George Bush right is very different from the Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, MAGA right. I'm clearly in the MAGA right.
Yeah, of course.
Nationalist, populist, national conservative movement. And so it's very different. And so what my comments from our last conversation is, I'm not schlepping for big businesses using migrant labor. People like my mom's family from South America. I'll say something about South America for a second. I visit there all the time, where my mom's from. If you parked a Boeing 747 at the local airport in the town of Barranca Bermeja, Colombia, and told everyone that plane's leaving at noon to the US, you would have literally half the town lined up there.
Sure, of
So
course.
the truth is somewhere in the middle, Zach,
Hmm.
that no, they're not fleeing absolute abject poverty.
Some are.
Some are, but I'll tell you, most people, whether it's in Colombia or in Brazil or in Nigeria, even relatively well off people, people who own businesses, who do very well, not by our standards, right?
Sure.
But do very well, would drop everything and come to the US overnight. Yes, there's a lot of great things here. I understand that. I'll tell you one thing too. It's not fair to those countries. It's the least patriotic thing you could do to your country is to get up and leave, take away your business, your productive capacity, essentially your brain draining your own country to
Hmm.
come to the US and to live off of our system. It's a great system. I love it. Perhaps
Hmm.
we'll debate capitalism someday. But I would just say one thing, which is that, and I'm guilty of this too in the past, but let's not assume the right this, the left that. We're just two folks having a conversation here. So on the
Yeah,
migration point, I would say, look, I am willing. I'm not necessarily convinced, but I am willing to accept. Look, the truth is, most of the migrant labor is not working at the Apple store or is not
true.
cutting hair. Most of the migrant labor is delivering on DoorDash and Uber Eats. I don't know about you, Zach.
I
I'm
don't know
actually
about
in
that.
I probably have only, well, no, but seriously, like in big cities like DC, they're driving for Uber, they're on Uber Eats, they're on
Sure,
DoorDash,
that's
they're in
okay.
hospitality, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So the truth is, a lot of Americans could do those jobs. They're not willing to do those jobs at the current wages, which are not living
Correct.
wages that are being paid. I think you
Correct.
and I would agree that businesses could do a better job
Well, that's the
of
problem.
actually playing a decent. I agree, right? And so this idea that Americans don't want to do this work, they don't want to do this work, ellipses, at the sub living wages that
Correct.
companies are willing to pay.
So here,
And
so
so
based on that, are you willing to argue to kind of take a Bernie Sanders argument here? And look, I'm not a Bernie Sanders guy, but are you willing to go down that road of going, we need to raise the minimum wage, we need to make circumstances so people can actually get a living wage from this stuff? Or are you going to say, no, this is up to the businesses. We're just going to hope that they'll, see God and say, hey, guess we got to pay people more, because I find that highly unlikely.
So the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage hasn't increased since 2009, but
Right.
wages since then are up 5% a year. So the idea that we need nominal wage growth to happen to be based on a federal statutory minimum wage increase that again hasn't happened in 16 years. Number
So
one,
the answer is no.
yes, let me not bury the lead. The answer is no, I do not support increasing the federal minimum wage. Second reason is because about a third of the people who earn the federal minimum wage are teenagers, and they're using that as an opportunity to jump into the labor force as opposed to build a career. The number of people who actually earn the federal minimum wage exactly is less than 700,000
But
a
if
year.
you make it $15 an hour, theoretically, couldn't you make the argument that a lot of these jobs that you're concerned about them not doing because it's not a living wage become a living wage?
Yeah, I wouldn't be opposed to $15 an hour minimum wage. I would
That
not be
sounds.
opposed to that. Right?
That's
I
all I'm
wouldn't be
saying.
opposed to that, but because again, that reflects where we are in reality today. Now,
Yeah,
look, when the prevailing wage was below 15, right? We're putting a floor there.
sure,
The second thing is that, and you know the business world well, Zach, is that you've got to pay for productivity. That's what you're
sure.
paying people to do. And
Hmm.
so a lot of people, a lot of businesses, me myself included, I employ people not necessarily on where their productive capacity is today, but where I think it can be. And a
Hmm.
lot of businesses turn to people, turn to folks with a felony conviction and say, look, I can't hire you at 25 bucks an hour. I can't. I just can't take the risk. I'm not in that position to do it. But if you worked for 15, I could get you there over 2 years because that would reflect the risk that I would take. And I'll tell
Hmm.
you one thing, and I think you and I are on the same page on this one. I completely 100% support increased job opportunities. I think that folks with convicted felony records have been wronged by society and wronged by business and end up actually recommitting crimes in many senses because they're not able to get employed, not able to borrow money, not able to take out a loan or rent an apartment because that stain is on their record forever. And they end up recommitting crime. Now, certainly they make their own decisions in the moment, but you
Hmm.
have to create the conditions for success. We're going on a tangent, but I'll leave it at this. Yes, I support higher wages. I think
Right.
those higher wages happen through free markets.
But that's not
By
going
the
to
way,
happen, though. That's the
no,
thing, though.
well,
Like,
so I'll tell you right now, we don't actually have free markets in a lot of places. If
we
you want
don't.
to, if you, well, I'll tell you here, if you want to cut hair, and I just talked about this on Fox last week, if you want to cut hair for a living, okay, if you want to cut hair for a living in my home state of Florida,
Mhm.
You got to pay a fee, take a test, and do 600 hours of instruction. That's crazy. Do you know who
600 is a
supports
lot.
that? The big haircut lobby. Companies like Supercuts who want to price out. I know you get your haircut very nicely. People who want to price out entrepreneurs who
Mhm.
want to cut hair, who want to start a business, many of whom do come from, let's be completely honest, come from Black America. And they're prevented from starting their own business because they don't have the license to cut hair. And it's a massive hoop to jump through. By the way, that's not capitalism. That's not a free market. A free market says if you have a good idea, if you want to put a product or a service in the market, you can do so without having to ask the government or the big business lobby for a permission slip to earn a living.
Well, certain
And so
things you
we're on
need
the
a
same page
permission
there.
slip for, though, right? Like I haircut, 600 hours is kind of crazy because I mean, even to become like a real estate agent, you need like 70 to 100 hours or something like
Yeah.
that. That's that's a ridiculous number. But I don't know if you're arguing against ridiculous levels to get to licensure or
Yeah.
just licensure in general, because
I'm
it,
arguing against ridiculous. So look, if you want to be a dentist, right? If you want to be a nurse, if you want to be
oh
an
yeah, I mean
STA,
those are anything
those are
medical, of
obvious,
course.
right?
Yeah.
But it wasn't until early last year, Zach, that Louisiana had an occupational license regulation if
Mhm.
you wanted to sell flower arrangements.
Yeah, I mean it's not smart. I'm fine with like intelligently getting like I mean this sort of speaks to exactly what I'm having a hard time with the Trump administration so far. I'm totally fine with thoughtful approaches to breaking down where there should and should not be regulations and trying to
Right.
figure out what is good and what's bad. But that has not been the approach to what Trump has done so far. I mean this federal freeze that he put on today is the perfect example of just not understanding nuance, right? Because the biggest challenge I have with this is not that he's trying to look through everything and make sure that it fits the executive orders and it fits his priorities. That's fine. What I have a hard time with is he just went, look, I'm not going to communicate anything. I'm just going to freeze everything, and people are going to be confused. Medicaid portals in all 50 states shut down, even if it's for just a couple hours. That's a problem, but they shut down because there's no understanding of what the hell is going on, and that is Trump in a nutshell. He did that all throughout his first term, and his second term seems to be worse by far already. Is that he doesn't care about detail. Trump is not a detail-oriented person. I think we could both agree on that. Trump is a broad spectrum. Here's my general approach to the issue. I'm just going to take a hammer to something that might need a scalpel, and we'll see what happens with the wreckage. That is a Trump approach. Sometimes it works out great. Sometimes it's a huge disaster. And the challenge that I have with it is when you're looking at huge things like federal funding I mean, look, he's breaking the Constitution to begin with here. He's going over Article 1. The power of the purse belongs to the legislative branch. He's overruling that with executive power. That is against the Constitution to begin with. But even if we were to ignore the fact that he's literally ignoring the Constitution and just focus on the fact that he is broadly applying a freeze to just the level of confusion in the federal government today and on previous days in terms of not just that, but the communication freeze, all the things he's doing at the federal level without properly communicating or getting into the nuanced detail of how you execute it is a very alarming pattern. He does not seem to give a shit about the fact that there is a ton of just absolute abject confusion in the
Mm.
federal government in response to his poorly thought out, no plan, seat of the pants approach to just going, here is a broad spectrum freeze. Here is a broad spectrum freeze on hiring. Here is a broad spectrum freeze on any communication. I mean, what if there's recalls on certain products that, like formula recalls? The FDA can't tell you anything about it because he froze it. He didn't go
Yeah.
and, because, okay, if there's a problem with public health, you can do it. No, there's no nuance involved. Just freeze it. That is a problem. And that's something that is not new. Trump has been doing that forever. And we're seeing it 8 days in. The broad spectrum effect this can have. People who are on Medicaid today did not get what they needed because they pretty much didn't have coverage. And to this point, I don't know if it's actually been resolved or not. But Trump says it will be. I don't know if that's true. But
Well,
these are the kinds of problems that happen.
just to clarify, the website went down. They were not denied Medicaid coverage.
Well, they weren't done, but they weren't able to process any of their claims.
Okay. Yeah. So I take the press secretary, Carolyn Levitt, at her word that this was a coincidence that would happen. That the Trump administration has been very clear that Medicaid was not Social
No,
Security.
she wasn't clear on that at all. She was asked today in her press conference if Medicaid was involved, and she was not clear. She did not have a clear answer on
So
that.
there was a statement issued later in the day. In any event, SNAP, Medicaid, Medicare were certainly not part of these phrases. We have
Correct.
to just zoom out for a second. We are in an emergency situation.
What's the
We are
emergency?
only bringing in $4.9 trillion a year in revenue, and we're spending $6.5 trillion, giving us a deficit
Yeah.
that is unsustainable. And so I agree with an approach that says, look, we might throw the baby out with the bathwater, but by and large, this situation is unsustainable. and we have to pause. Now, of course, the 25 million Americans who depend on food stamps, of course, they're not going to be affected. And
Good,
the initial
but that's not what
confusion.
I'm saying.
No, I know that. But what I'm saying is that Medicare, Medicaid, Social
No, I
Security.
understand, but that's not my point. My point is this is an extremely detail lacking, confusing approach to governing, and somebody who is trying to save money. And really, the only way to do that, both of us know, is to go through line by line and balance your budget out. This is not the approach.
Maybe that was a time to do that 15 or 20 years ago. I think you do have to kind of just pause things right now and see what happens. Well, because we're in a really bad position, Zach.
But what are the consequences? We've been in this position for
$36 trillion
decades.
in debt is the consequences. We had 30% inflation under Biden. Those are the consequences.
39. 9.1 was the peak. 30? Where'd you get that number?
Sorry, 30% from January 2021.
Okay, but the highest inflation rate was 9.1.
No, but I'm talking about $100 worth of stuff that cost $100 in Jan 21 cost $130. The overall CPI basket increased by a cumulative 30% over those 4 years. In any event, I would rather, and I speak, I think, for a lot of people, I would rather err on the side of a bigger, bolder approach to get spending in order than this incremental, let's go line by line, honey. Let's sit down. Let's look
bold is messy.
It is messy, but you know what's messier is the status quo. It's messier is continuing this game of extend and pretend. What's messier is spending money we don't have on things we don't.
I'm not arguing that. I'm not arguing for that. I'm arguing that we take.
You're arguing with you're against the approach. You're against the mechanism.
It's a bad approach.
Yeah, it's a bad approach. And I understand it. I understand how some people could have been frustrated. I'll tell you, most Medicaid and Medicare recipients aren't refreshing the site. That was a separate error. The Trump administration has made clear earlier this evening that this was not intended to affect in any way, shape, or form those vital benefits for Americans.
I get that, but that's not my point. My point is that Donald Trump is not approaching this like an adult. That's my approach.
I'll tell you. Okay, well, let's use more objective language for a second here. I do want to nail this down for a second. Can you agree that Donald Trump is not approaching this like a typical DC politician? Yes,
of course.
Okay, so let's just use that language because I mean the adult and the child
frames it the way that you want it to be. He's not approaching it this like an adult. He's going at one broad stroke. That's it. He's not using any nuance for what
I'm glad he didn't approach the Columbia situation like a DC politician because it would have taken 3 weeks. There have been 19 subcommittees involved, and we would have gotten nothing out of it.
Now, I understand
literally between hole 3 and hole 4 at the Doral Trump resort, and he decided we're going to send out this tweet about tariffs.
But what are the stakes?
But a lot of people, I think,
2 planes are the stakes. The stakes of the budget are
no. I think you got to admit, Zach, the stakes are bigger than those 2 planes and those several hundred people. I'll tell you why. Because you're sending a message to any country that's going to get these repatriation flights. You got to admit, Zach, that if you were a country that was going to be accepting folks tomorrow or on Friday, you're going to think twice about deterring that flight after the Trump Columbia situation. He set precedent, did he not?
The precedent that he set with the Columbia situation, I think there's a time and a place for what he did.
Speaking of time and place, where were you when you saw that come down? Because that was hilarious, by the way.
I think I was home when I saw it, and because at first, the Colombian president pretty much said, "Hey, I'm going to retaliate," and my response was, "Oh, he's already getting deep into trouble with this approach, and that's not going to go well." And then he ended up winning that, and I thought, all right, this is going to embolden Trump to a point where he's going to think this will work every single time, and I think that's
but it did work this time,
right? It's like. Yes, unquestionably, it did work here. But like I made an analogy in one of the posts that I made of it's sort of like a college kid beating the shit out of an 8th grader. It's like, yeah, okay, good job. You're not big and strong because you did that. And it's going to embolden this guy to go up to a guy his own age and try to do the same shit. And it's going to be like, whoopsies, that didn't work out so well. And you're going to get pummeled yourself. So that, it's the same thing. Like, he may try to do this when the stakes are higher, when he's not trying to, it's not about, setting a precedent on accepting flights. It's setting a precedent on major border policy, like with Mexico, where Mexico is not going to just go, oh, you're going to threaten me with tariffs. Oh, fine, I'll do it. They're probably going to just have retaliatory tariffs and end up with a trade war. And that is a problem. So, I think that the precedent is a problem. But the issue that I have is that he takes that approach to everything. And the budget is not a place for that approach. It's not a place you go, shut down the whole government. We have an emergency. We got to figure it out. It's like, this has been an emergency for decades. And it's not really, and that proves that in and of itself, it is not an emergency. It is just the way that countries function. If you look at pretty much any major country in the world, they are woefully in debt. Debt is a part of a country. And it's not like people use this number of $36 trillion as the boogeyman, like we're never going to get out from under this situation. This is the status quo for everyone. It's not like we're alone in this and the US is just like drowning in debt and the rest of the world is flourishing. It's not the case. The whole world is drowning in debt because debt is normal. It's okay to have debt. It's okay to have a deficit. It's not okay to not have any plan for how to handle shutting down critical functions of the government because you need time to analyze how your own executive orders work in concert with it. You should have done that before you made the executive order. That's the kind of stuff where people look at Trump and go, this is a child. It's not an adult. It may not be that he is a child in all things, but he does act like a child sometimes and just throw a tantrum and go, I want it this way, so I'm just going to do a hammer instead of a scalpel. And hey, if I break some skulls, it doesn't matter. I still got the job done. And that is such a dangerous approach to running the most powerful country in the world with the largest economy in the world. I would much rather have somebody who wants to find a middle ground between a scalpel, which I agree is the standard, politician way of doing things, and the just hatchet this guy has taken to the whole thing. There's a middle ground, and he is definitely not the guy who's taking that. But I think when we get through the Trump era, when we get to the end of his presidency, and he ultimately probably fails on a number of what he's trying to do and does not give the Republican Party a platform to seek re-election, we're going to land somewhere in the middle with somebody like, Gavin Newsom, somebody you're going to hate. It's going to be a bad situation for you guys because, to me, the Republican Party is like the dog that caught the car. You chase this car forever. Finally, you caught it. And now you're looking at this big hunk of metal and trying to gnaw on it. You're like, I don't know what the hell to do with this thing. That scares me. And that's what this whole first 8 days feels like. The dog who caught the car.
Interesting. Well, we caught the car and we had a great first week, and not just for Republicans, but for the entire country, I think. Let me ask you a question. Do you want Trump to fail or succeed?
Sure.
Personal politics aside, do you want him to fail or succeed?
It's a difficult question because I want America to succeed. I don't want Trump to succeed for a very simple reason. I think what Trump and MAGA stands for is not good for the majority of the country. I think it's good for a segment of the country. And I think that I would argue, look, I have no data to back this up. My argument would be about 70-30. I think 30% of the country would be very satisfied with a reorientation around a Project 2025 type government. Because unquestionably, that is what Trump is implementing right now. It may not be, chapter and verse, but that is what he's doing. And I think that the majority of the country looks at most of this and goes, no, I don't want it. It doesn't work for me. It's not inclusive. It's restrictive from a religious perspective. It's adversarial, but at the same time, nationalistic. It's reckless and dangerous for a lot of people. Not for everybody, but for a lot of people. So for me, I want to see that segment of thinking fail. I don't want to see America fail, but I want Trumpism and the bullying nature that comes from him, that whole, this, especially from this like toxic masculinity perspective, so many younger men are being emboldened to be just horrendous people because Donald Trump is what they're using as a measuring stick for what is masculine, and the approach that it's just, to me, it's a very backwards way of thinking. It's a reverse way of thinking societally. And I don't want that. I don't want America to fail in the attempt to get rid of MAGA, but I don't want Trump to succeed in that regard. I'd like for him to balance out the budget responsibly and not bully most of the country, but I very much expect that he will do exactly what I don't want him to do, and that is why I want him personally.
Who are these people that you think will benefit from the Trump MAGA agenda? Can you just describe them?
Sure. I think that definitely the religious right. There's no question about that. I think people who see Christianity as the religion of America, that those folks would definitely like it. I think, let's just be honest, white people in general, I think you look at the exit polls, you look at the actual numbers, white people voted in droves for Donald Trump, and people of color did not.
But as a relative to the 2020 election, there was a massive increase in Black Americans, Hispanic American support for Trump. You agree with that?
If you're looking at it relatively,
you're going to go from, of course.
It's not even close.
But
but again, the reason, and it goes back to my point before, the reason that happened was not because they were putting prices above their
folks are allowed to vote their own, right? Their own.
Of course, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have done it. I'm just saying that the motivation wasn't because there's not risk for them based on their.
But I'm trying to understand. Like so, I guess is your position that somehow Trump's policies Because I think about it this way. If you're getting rid of cheap migrant labor, think about it. Cheap migrant labor is
Mm,
exploited by businesses and to the detriment
yeah.
of Native Americans, white, black, rural, urban. There are people working in meat
Mm,
packing factories in the Midwest who were not in this country a year ago, who took a job of a
mm,
young black man who was working in that plant. And so when you think about what migrant labor has done, there's no question people are going to be disadvantaged by these policies. Businesses that rely on and exploit
sure.
migrant labor among them, right? But I think the point is that most people will benefit if we can bring down inflation, if we can in some specific areas. And again, we can have this. I know we're going to get into this whole
Well,
well,
inflation's already
well,
down.
let's talk about getting it down more. And there's that's
How?
a whole
Why? It's
separate discussion.
exactly where
But
it's supposed to be.
there's well,
No,
we're running
let's
up
have it.
we're running up on
It's
45. But there and I want to have that discussion too. But there are and it's interesting because,
yeah.
all of a sudden Democrats care about egg prices after, 4 years. They're all talking about egg prices.
I didn't care about them then or now. I
It's
mean,
it's it's a
it's just a
nuanced
nuanced
discussion. I really
discussion. I
shouldn't say
mean,
Democrats. I should say the Democratic Party, as articulated by a number of high-profile accounts on X. I guess the point is, Zach, that yes, some people will be hurt by these policies. I think the people who are not serving the country well, the corporations who are not serving the country well, they will be hurt. But ultimately, time will tell. I think that there's no question that Donald Trump's policies are already working. The border crossings have completely collapsed. It turns out, Zach, you didn't need some bipartisan
sure.
border bill hoax scam to actually close the southern border. You needed a president who was resilient.
The
Well, nothing
dictator.
he's done with respect to the border is being seriously questioned from a constitutional standpoint. So,
There are things that are being questioned from a constitutional standpoint, though. You do accept that. I mean, this freeze on spending
well, look,
is
it
unconstitutional.
just got paused by a federal judge. So I understand that. A lot of things are going to get litigated. A lot of things got litigated in the Trump term where he prevailed.
But I have a question for you though. Doesn't it bother you that the president you support is consistently getting sued successfully for
Well, when you
trying to
say
ignore the
sued
Constitution?
successfully, what do you mean? You got a judge to give a preliminary
I
stay.
mean, he's been sued. He's been sued across the
Well, but
birthright citizenship. I'll just use
yeah.
two examples: birthright citizenship and the federal freeze, both of which he
Oh,
was
of course.
instantly sued
I
and
get sued all the
lost.
time, but I can tell you this: that when you say,
That's not my point.
I mean, I'll
I'm
just
not
tell you,
talking
it
about
just
you.
happens. I mean, you work in business and you work as an investor; it just happens. Well, so my point is, anybody can.
But you're not acting unconstitutionally. That's
Yeah.
my question about the
Well, look,
constitutionality of what he's
the
doing.
constitutionality question is ultimately decided by the Supreme Court. The birthright citizenship question will go to the court. This federal freeze will likely get appealed to the Supreme
Uh-huh.
Court. So, look, there are things that are
And
going
he'll
to get
lose on both.
thrown in front of a single federal judge who's going to make a unilateral decision that will likely get overturned when it goes to the circuit, which could very well.
No, he'll lose those in the Supreme Court.
I
He'll lose both those
you know,
cases because it's an open and shut
I
case. They're
disagree.
both
I
clear
disagree. I think
violations.
birthright citizenship
How?
as understood. I'll give you one example. If the Mexican
Mm,
ambassador who lives in Washington D.C. has a child, that
mhm.
child is not a United States citizen. Okay. Well, no, actually,
Really?
it isn't because diplomatic staff is excluded from the birthright citizenship. So, okay, well, it's a
Okay, but that's
technicality.
a
So hold on.
technicality of it.
If a Mexican ambassador, a senior foreign affairs official from the government of Mexico who resides here, who's legally allowed to be here, has a child, and that child is
Mm,
not a citizen at birth of the United States, why would
mhm.
someone who is 20 feet into the country after illegally crossing the border having a child? I mean, you got to understand that point, Zach, right? That if you
No, because the 14th Amendment
yeah,
is clear.
subject to the
It's
jurisdiction thereof. Illegal aliens are not subject to the jurisdiction thereof of the United States.
Of course they are. Of course they are. If you commit a crime in the United States, you were charged for that. You were tried and charged with that crime. That is making you subject to the. If you come to this country, you're using this, ambassador because you have diplomatic status. You could do whatever the hell you want. But if you don't, you are subject to the laws of the country. You can't just come in here and do whatever you want. You will be charged and convicted under U.S. law. That makes you subject to the laws. That's why it's like if I can make that case
When
in
was the
10
14th?
seconds,
What was the
so can
14th
a
Amendment drafted
federal
in response to? What period
litigator.
of time in the U.S.? Civil War,
I
right? It
actually
was
don't know.
designed to ensure that the children of slaves could be full United States
Okay, but you
citizens.
can make the same argument for the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment was designed because you needed a militia of people who were there to act as the army. We have an army now. We don't need that. So
Separate
should we get rid of the
discussion.
Second Amendment?
Hard,
No, it's the same.
hard,
It's the
hard
exact same
disagree.
point, though.
But
but it's the exact same point. You're saying that circumstances
Well,
change,
no, no,
therefore the
I didn't say
amendment
the
is different.
circumstances
It's an
changed. What
amendment.
I said was is that and by the way, the Second Amendment, as interpreted by the Bruin decision from 2022 of the Supreme Court, found that you actually have to look at the context of gun laws in the nation's early founding to understand the application and constitutionality of them today. The second thing I would note is that you have to
Mhm.
understand the context of the 14th Amendment, Section 1, around birthright citizenship. But let's just end with this question. I'm curious to get it. Someone from Russia flies here to
Mhm.
Miami specifically to have a kid, to be a US citizen, to then use that child's US citizenship to bring the rest of the family over, good or bad, Zach, yes or no?
I don't think it's a proper question. I think that particular set of circumstances may be bad, and if you can make an adjustment to this to make it make sense, I'm fine with that. But to me, it opens up a bigger question about how we deal with the Constitution, and it brings me right back to my point from before, which is if we are looking at the context of today's world within how we're interpreting the Constitution, then we need to reinterpret many things that the right has said. Hey, no, this is what it is because this is the Constitution. Okay, well, if we're going to talk about that,
Well,
let's get to the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment was drafted very much in the concept that the founders of this country did not want to have a standing army. So that's why the language of a well-regulated militia is direct as day in the Second Amendment of that is what makes it legal to have a firearm. So by the standard of reinterpreting for today, we do not have a well-regulated militia unless you are literally part of our standing army. And therefore, the Second Amendment makes it so you should not be able to have a firearm. If we want to reinterpret all these amendments based on today, I'm open to that discussion.
yeah.
And I would be willing to make a concession in the 14th Amendment for the Second Amendment. But I'm not going to sit here and not notice that there is a dramatic level of hypocrisy when the right focuses on one particular piece of the Constitution versus another
Wait,
when it's
are you
beneficial or
willing
not
to let
beneficial
us
to their
give up our
argument.
guns if you give up your illegals? Is that what I'm hearing, Zach? I got to run that
Oh,
back. I got to run
my
that back.
God.
I got to run up the food chain and see if we're willing to make that deal. By the way, I think this is an important debate for us to
I
have.
would make that
The
deal.
idea of constitutional infallibility, the idea of originalism, right? Originally looking at the Constitution.
Mhm.
There's a lot you said there on the Second Amendment that I disagree with, but to be fair, I do want it to be a longer discussion. That's a really interesting point to leave off. Is the way the Constitution
Mm.
was written in the summer of 1787 obviously very different to the conditions we have today. The First Amendment made clear that the
Yes.
government shall not infringe on free expression. And yet, that's what they told Facebook and
Hmm.
Twitter to do. But again, we didn't have social networks back then.
But that's yeah, but that's where you and I would largely disagree. I think I think that was to me at least the First Amendment to me does not apply to
But if the
businesses. I
government
think it
is
applies
telling
to
a business
individuals.
to shut people up who are saying things, and by the way, I don't care what it is. If you're saying, oh, you can't say this about Gaza or you can't say this about Palestine, that is just as wrong and despicable to censor that as it would to censor concerns about COVID.
I think you're right. If the government tells you to do
Oh
it, I
no,
think
but
it's
no, yeah,
wrong.
that's the
But
point
if
that
the
I'm making. Look, if
company,
Facebook,
yeah, no, I wrote it. But if
yeah,
Facebook
but Facebook, right,
independently
and the
decides they
fact
want to do that,
pattern
I
as
think
it
that's
stands right
totally
now is
fine.
that Mark Zuckerberg has admitted that the government is losing their mind.
No, I agree with that. I think that's a
Good.
mistake. That was a mistake from the Biden administration. Shouldn't have been. I mean, granted, we have to remember the circumstances of that situation. It was a pandemic that people didn't really
We
fully understand
understood
the
it pretty
circumstances of, and
quickly early
we
on,
should
but again, it doesn't justify. I don't think it
not really.
justifies ever. I don't think there's any situation where you ever censor speech, especially in a pandemic, is actually when you need as much free speech as possible. At the end of the day, open debate makes us better, and whether you're proven wrong or I just did a
I agree
workshop
with
with a couple
that.
high school students on Sunday, and it was I ended with this, and I think you'll appreciate this, Zach. When you're having a debate, you can only have one top priority. Do you want to seek truth or do you want to be right? And the reality of the situation is, I think what we're trying to do here earnestly with United Debates is we're trying to put that desire to be right, to get one over, and actually
Yeah,
try to seek truth. Now, that will obviously come with us guarding our views, but there has been some consensus, and not in a
sure.
forced, artificial, superficial way, but some consensus around what
No, for
truth
sure.
actually is. And that truth, as you know, is not static, it's evolving.
Right. No, I agree with that. I mean, look, speaking of evolving truths, I don't know how many people know. I mean, I know people on my channel know this, but I was a pretty hardcore Republican for a long time. And, I was open to hearing other perspectives and looking at the data. And over the time that I went through, especially economic data, when I would go through it, I'd go, oh, I'm wrong. And that's how I ended up being here on the left side of things, where I am very much open to seeking the truth as opposed to seeking validation from my own perspective. So I do think that that's a part of what we do here, which is great. And yeah, of course, we're going to guard our own perspectives to a certain degree. And I think that I'm a data driven person. So if you can show me data that shows me that I'm incorrect, I will not only, say I'm wrong, I will change my mind and defend the data. So, I think that when we get into discussions like ivermectin, that's my wheelhouse. I definitely like that kind of stuff because I can come to the table with a lot to show that, it's not the case. But I do think there's one more thing I want to talk about before we go, which is I don't fully and I truly have a question. It's not a grievance against Trump. It's truly a question. Things like the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Agreement and NATO, things like that, where the U.S. is definitely putting in the lion's share of the money into these sorts of programs. But I think we can all agree that having these programs is not such a bad thing necessarily. Why is Trump's approach just dipping out of them and threatening people to pay more money or he's going to dip out? Like, do you think that's an effective approach to diplomacy when there's so much on the line? Like, think about if say the bird flu that people, it's not becoming a huge thing just yet, but has the potential to become a very dangerous pandemic. If we were not part of the World Health Organization when that happened, it would be the difference of millions of lives. Why does Trump and why do people on the right tend to think that this just rip the Band-Aid off, get out of it is the right approach when there are so many viable, reasonable reasons to not do it? Because that is a theme that I'm seeing in the early days of the Trump administration of, yes, there are good things for here. Yes, there are bad things here. But because there are bad things, I want out of this completely. Can you explain to me why you and the MAGA right specifically are comfortable with that approach to
So we'll take each of those. First, with NATO, Donald Trump has been very clear that NATO countries are not paying their fair share, which is stipulated as 2% of GDP on national defense. They're not paying their fair share. If they're not paying their fair share, they need to pay their fair share. They're moving it up to 5. Right? So that's the first thing. Yeah. The second thing is, so we haven't threatened to pull out of NATO. What we've said is that
Trump has not right now, but I'm talking about
was the first other points on Paris and on WHO are relevant to the early year. Yeah,
he's already out.
Your point about, by the way, the WHO. Okay, you're talking about the WHO for a second. The WHO that in 2020 said publicly that there was no evidence that COVID had human-to-human transmission. They were parroting talking points directly from the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping had undue influence. We were spending $1.2 billion a year to fund them, and it was just a propaganda machine. And so I can understand.
But
in January of 2020, they repeated the Chinese talking point that there was no human-to-human transmission of COVID. That would have been important evidence to know.
But do we have evidence though that they knew?
Yeah, we have evidence. I mean, yes, there was absolutely evidence that the Chinese knew in late.
The Chinese knew, but did
the Chinese were in communication with the World Health Organization?
But the Chinese could just be lying to that's what I'm saying. Is it like
I don't think the World Health Organization is parroting the lie? Do I think the World Health Organization deliberately lied, knowing that? No, I don't think that. Did they accept information from habitual liars in Beijing? Yes, and they parroted it without any sort of scrutiny.
Well, where else are they going to get the information? It was started in China.
I'm glad we admit that it started in China, but it's specifically in a lab.
Of course it did. I don't agree with that necessarily.
Well, you do know
I mean, it may have. That there's no. The CIA has come around. Look, I think it's possible, but I think the fact that people say that's where it came from, it's like, well, you don't know.
Well, China's never going to let us actually get to the bottom of it. But in any event, the WHO failed the 100-year pandemic test. They failed it, as far as I'm concerned, as far as all the evidence is concerned. Well, because again, very early on, as in January 2020, when this thing was still very nascent, they repeated talking points without, peer review, independent analysis. Not a good thing to do. I didn't see the WHO repeating our talking points without their own independent analysis, and we're actually trustworthy as opposed to China. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that the Paris Climate Accord is not something that aligns with American interests. We'll have a longer discussion about the climate. Trump has been clear, and I agree with him. We want clean air, we want clean water, but subjecting ourselves to EV mandates, subjecting ourselves to these draconian European policies that hold back our economy and our workers and consumer and business choice, that does not do anything but harm us.
But we're one of 4 countries in the whole world that's not in it, and the other 3 are
Well,
Yemen, Libya, and Iran. I mean, is that the group
Well,
we
that's
want
a
to
really
be part
interesting
of?
way to associate these countries. I'll tell you that the Trump administration did not coordinate with Yemen or Libya. Right.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that, do we really want to share our decision-making
Uh,
process with them? It
I'll
doesn't seem
tell you
like that's a
this:
very good
this
idea.
decision making on Paris was made independently of of that.
No, I
So I
know,
think
but I'm saying
it's
Trump
an
arrived
interesting
where they did.
debate tactic that, oh, the only people that who did this were these people, and the only people who walked their dogs
It's
this
the
morning were
truth.
me and a convicted felon who lives next door. I understand that, but again, look at
It's
the
not the
merit
same.
of the decision. I'm not a big believer that, a decision is good or bad because the other folks who made that decision are good or bad, right? Oh, because we did XYZ and the UK and France and Spain also did it, that means it's a good decision. I've reviewed the Paris Climate Accord on its own merits. I think it's a disaster. I think we should absolutely care about the environment, about clean air and clean water. The way to do it is to enforce environmental regulation here that protects those natural resources and to ensure that businesses are not polluting, but it's not to thwart consumer choice and foist these EV mandates. I have an electric car. I have a Tesla. I'm proud of it. I know you're not proud of Elon. That's okay. But the thing is, Zach, that consumers will make their own choices, and that's a good thing. So to your final point, NATO hasn't come up so far of this administration. Trump's talking point has been clear. We
So
need a
far.
certain
Yeah.
percentage of defense spending on that. And there will be a separate discussion there. By
Yeah.
the way, you don't get to take from us and use our men and women in uniform if you're not willing to put your women in uniform, men and women in uniform.
Well, they
No,
are, just not the
not
level that
well.
he wants. I mean, but that's not really my question. My question was the broader effect that, like, the rip the Band-Aid off, to use your previous phrase, throwing the
Yeah,
baby out with the bathwater. Why couldn't he go in and negotiate these things and make a
I
better
don't think there's
deal?
anything
He's a
to
big
negotiate with.
negotiator.
I think
Why is he not doing that?
the WHO.
He can negotiate funding based on a different
I
approach to
I
how they want to communicate.
I
If the
don't think. Listen,
communication's the
I
problem,
think
things
that
like
the
that.
idea, and again, this is not a theoretical argument, Zach. It's an empirical one. The
Mhm.
WHO did not justify its existence in the worst pandemic in 100 years, also known as COVID.
Of course it
How
did.
so?
What are you talking about? Without the WHO, the world would have had so many
How?
more deaths. Their ability to get the vaccine all across the world was integral to saving
I
millions and millions and millions of lives. This concept that they had, that you're demonizing them
No, I
strictly because that they
disagree.
made an inappropriate statement in
The
January.
vaccine was not anywhere near as effective as folks said. There were massive negative side effects.
What are you talking about? Look at the number. The numbers are aggressively clear. I have no idea how you can, with a straight face, make that argument. If you look at the number of infections and deaths when the vaccine comes
Yeah,
out and is widely available, the numbers fall off a cliff
yeah,
globally. The vaccine was distributed to
yeah.
billions of people. That's
Separate
not a
sep
random
separate
mistake.
discussion. Look
That's
at
what
all-cause
happened.
mortality. Separate discussion, but it's okay.
Very quickly, I know we don't want to dive deep into a COVID discussion,
That'll be a good next
but
one, actually. That's a
the
good
vaccine.
natural way to end it is, where the next one's gonna be.
Yeah, for sure. I'd be happy to have that one because I mean I've worked in the pharmaceutical space for a very long time. Um, the to me the biggest challenge with this whole thing, this argument that it wasn't the vaccine, is what else
We
could
can
it
have
have
it.
possibly
Yeah,
been?
look, I'd
The,
have to
the,
see the exact data that you're referring to. I just disagree. Look, the reality is that very early on, it became clear that COVID had a low fatality rate, less than 0.5%. As natural immunity,
It's not accurate. That's not accurate. It was 2%. That was 2% prior to the vaccine. When the vaccine came, that is what
we'd
lowered
have to look at
the
a
death
control
rate.
group. We'd also have to look that at the same time that as this vaccine came out in November of 2020, that there was also this massive increase in natural immunity. There was a wave in early 21. Zach, I want to have this debate with you. I think it's going to be really good for us, but I also have to have time to look at the data that you're
It will.
referring to. Otherwise, I can't
I'd
actively
be
refute
happy
it.
to.
In any event, a very
No,
big
of course.
week for Trump, whether you agree or disagree. I think most Americans agree. I was one poll I just saw came out, by the way, from JL, that 1 out of 5, 22% of Democrats approve of the job in the early days of the Trump administration, which was surprising to me, Zach. And I think opens the door
Mm.
to a lot of moderate Democrats looking at the early days of the Trump administration and approving it. Its results. Look, you can disagree with the tweets, you can disagree with the exact processes, but I think a lot of Democrats are going to come over to this side and say, look, may not like him, may not like the temperament, may not like the tweets. I find him hilarious, but that's okay. And we'll look at it at the results. But in the meantime, in between time, another great episode of United Debates of America. Zach, always a pleasure. We'll be back next
Yeah.
week getting into our regular routine. I like this Tuesday night routine. I think this is actually good. Gives us a chance to decompress a little bit.
Get the week under wraps. Before we go, I'll make a different prediction. Instead of Democrats getting on board with it, I think there's a very good chance that by this date next year, Donald Trump will not be president and will be removed by his own party because he has done such an unconstitutional job. That to me is the path I see. So, we'll see which direction it goes, but I definitely think there is a chance, given the direction I've seen of this first week, that we are heading for a constitutional crisis.
When you say removed by his own party, you saying an impeachment in which Republicans would vote in both the Senate and the House, so literally removed from office. You think Donald Trump will be moved from office? What odds are you?
I don't think that he will, but I think the odds are better.
What odds are you willing to offer
than they are? 10%. There's like a 10 in my mind. There's like a 10% chance. It depends on how far. I think it's going to depend on society, because I think it's really going to be a lot of different things. Like, for example, the fact that you can go into schools and churches as a first step for how you can get people deported by ICE. That is unquestionably a stepping stone to some bigger, more aggressive decisions and some huge mistakes. And, look, we've seen him go over the head of the Constitution a number of times.
Allegedly.
I think Trump's problem.
Remember, anything can get sued on the basis of it being unconstitutional. It's up for the courts to decide. There hasn't been any hearings. There hasn't been any testimony. There was.
I think we could. I know. We could probably both agree, though, he'll likely lose these cases. Sure, allegedly, but unquestionably, I think the odds are good that he'll lose.
Very
unquestionably, but I think there's a very good chance the Supreme Court will rule against him on the birthright issue and on the freeze issue,
favor, which is the right course of action to do. But that's okay.
Highly unlikely.
Interesting. I disagree with the 10%. You and I can talk on a side bet on that particular point, but we might just.
I'll take that bet. Give me a big payout. But it was a good episode. I'm glad we did this, and I think that every week it will continue to be this eventful. I'm kind of at this point taking a long list of how many times did Trump ignore the Constitution. I'll have a nice new list for you next week. But I do like the idea of talking about COVID next week. It could be interesting. At least part of the discussion could be COVID, because I do think that it's definitely misunderstood by a dramatic number of people, and there's a lot of talking points, especially on the right side of the aisle, that are very.
Well, I think 5 years into the declaration of a pandemic, which would be in early March, would be an interesting time to take stock, because there's no question about it. There should always be a debate. There should always be a postmortem on what exactly happened. And for me, Zach, it wasn't just the shutdowns of schools and businesses. It was the shutdown on free speech and debates across America. You weren't allowed to say certain things because you weren't an epidemiologist, that your social media was deplatformed, et cetera. And so there's a lot there. I look forward to having that discussion. And
yeah, I'm happy to do it. I think it's part of a broader discussion. Really, I do think it would be an interesting thing to talk about that, because there will be places we overlap as well. I do think that there are speech issues that the Biden administration got wrong, and that needs to be remedied. But I do think there are a number of things that they got right and that people don't understand because they are just over it. And frankly, it sets a bad precedent to not look back in history and find out the truth.
100%, Zach. Look forward to it.
Yeah.
Make debate great again. That's kind of where we leave off on in a civil way. And look, it's going to get heated. It's going to get rigorous. It has to be. But it's a precondition for coming together. If we can't talk about our problems, we can never solve them, and we can never come together as a country. And I'd like to think in a small way that even though you and I have never had the pleasure of meeting in person, that we are coming together in a one-on-one way around these political differences and getting closer to truth.
Absolutely. We got to do an in-person episode soon. I'll come up to DC.
Introduce you to the big guy. All righty.